Hey everyone, welcome back to Here in Apologetics. Super pumped you're joining us today to have Dr. Nevin Climenhaga. He's a senior research fellow at Australian Catholic University, and we'll be talking about the problem of evil and looking at skeptical theism and like problems that may pose for like natural theology and whatnot. So Nevin, thank you so much for joining me. I'm super excited. How's everything down in Australia right now?
Well, thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm excited to be here. Things are going well here. As I was saying before we started, I'm just getting over a bit of a cold here. But yeah, doing well, working from home today. Yeah.
Fun. And I'm super excited. And as my day is wrapping up, your day is just beginning. So I always think that's
Mhm.
super fun, how we can do
Yep.
this even through crazy differences in like time zones and whatnot. So let's just get into like the topic today. You want to talk a little bit about like who you are, what you do, and what got you interested in topics like skeptical theism and like natural theology and whatnot?
Yeah, so I'm a senior research fellow at Australian Catholic University in the Dianoia Institute of Philosophy here in Melbourne, Australia. Um, the academic titles are a little bit different here in Australia, but it's the equivalent of what you'd call an associate professor in the United States. So we don't have tenure here, but it's basically a tenured professor. Um, so I got into philosophy, like I think this is true for a lot of Christian philosophers, like got into philosophy through thinking about Christianity and the rationality of Christian belief. And that led me to thinking about epistemology more generally. And so a lot of my research is in epistemology, broadly conceived, not religious epistemology specifically. But I've also done some work applying my work in epistemology on probability theory, especially to problems in religious epistemology. So the paper that we're going to talk about today of mine is called If We Can't Tell What Theism Predicts, We Can't Tell Whether God Exists, Skeptical Theism and Bayesian Arguments from Evil. And this paper is me looking at the particular way that skeptical theists, and we can talk about what that term means in a minute, have responded to Bayesian arguments from evil. And I think the way that at least many of them have done so doesn't actually work very well when you dig into a good probabilistic epistemology.
Yeah, that's super great. So thanks for that, Nevin. So let's dive into this. Like, what is this challenge for skeptical theists that you're going to present here that you did in this paper?
Yeah, so skeptical theism, as the term is used in the contemporary literature, is a strategy for responding to the problem of evil that emphasizes our cognitive limitations. For example, our ignorance of the reasons God could have for allowing evil. The problem that I present in the paper is a narrow one, in that it doesn't challenge this general strategy, but it just challenges the specific way that some skeptical theists have applied it in responding to one particular formulation of an atheistic argument from evil, namely a Bayesian formulation.
Yeah, it's super cool. And I like this because it seems like as we're going to roll through this, that like a lot of my intuitions that are going to line up as well with this paper. So let's talk about like what are these like Bayesian arguments from evil?
Yeah, so in the paper, I present a simple version of a Bayesian argument from evil, according to which the evils we observe are evidence against theism, in the sense that they lower the probability of theism. The argument goes as follows. Premise one, relative to our background knowledge, the evils we observe are more probable given theism than given atheism. Premise two, if that's the case, if the evils we observe are more probable given theism than given atheism, then those evils lower the probability of theism. That is, the probability of theism, given those evils and our background knowledge, is lower than the probability of theism on our background knowledge alone. And then it follows from these two premises that conclusion, the evils we observe lower the probability of theism, i.e., are evidence against theism. So this argument is Bayesian in that the way we show the second premise to be true is by appeal to Bayes' theorem, according to which the probability of a hypothesis given some evidence is a mathematical function of the prior probability of that hypothesis, the probability of the evidence given that hypothesis, and the probability of the evidence given the negation of that hypothesis. Now, many proponents of Bayesian arguments from evil will argue for much stronger conclusions than the one I just presented. They'll argue that the evils we observe are strong evidence against theism, for example, or that after accounting for evil, theism is less probable than not. Theism is probably false. One can reject those arguments while still accepting the conclusion of this modest argument I've just presented, that evil is some evidence against theism. I focus on this modest argument in my paper because the skeptical theists I'm targeting have denied even its conclusion. And later on, we can come back to whether skeptical theists really should deny the conclusion of this modest argument.
Okay, so we had these like Bayesian arguments from evil, where generally what it's looking at is like given what we know about the world, the evils that we observe are more likely on atheism than theism. So that'd be like an atheistic like argument from like a Bayesian argument. And you're saying like, hey, we're gonna focus on this argument and show that like a certain response from skeptical theists is gonna like pose a big challenge that we're gonna talk about. So like, what is like you talk about like the inscrutability response, like what is that and like what's it gonna imply when we're looking at this?
Yeah, so my target is what I call the inscrutability response to this argument. So in the argument that I just gave, the second premise, the premise that says that if evil is more probable given atheism than theism, then it lowers the probability of theism. That premise is unassailable. It just follows from Bayes' theorem, which follows from the mathematical axioms of probability. So all the interesting discussion surrounds the first premise, that the evils we observe are less probable given theism than given atheism. By the way, for simplicity, I'll sometimes just talk about evil lowering the probability of theism, but I think it's important to be clear that the relevant claim is not that the mere existence of evil lowers the probability of theism, but that the evils we observe do so. And that's important because one might think that evils of some kind or other are unsurprising on theism, but that evils of the kind and magnitude that we observe are much more surprising. And I think that the more sophisticated arguments from evil in the literature are clear about this and appeal to the particular evils that we observe rather than just the existence of some kind of evil or other. So with that caveat, the interesting premise in the argument is that evil, or being careful, the evil we observe, is less likely on theism than atheism. Now, one might deny this premise. So, for example, some theists will deny this premise because they think they have a plausible theodicy, that is, an explanation of why God would allow evil. Most skeptical theists, though, have not denied premise one outright. Instead, they've argued that we don't know whether premise one is true. We don't know whether evil is more likely on theism or on atheism. That's because our cognitive limitations make us unable to say anything about how probable evil is given theism. We are just radically ignorant of this probability. So this is what I call the inscrutability response. I call it this because it claims that the probability of evil on theism is just completely inscrutable to us. So for example, here's how Mike Bergman puts it. He says that we are, quote unquote, in the dark about this probability. And there's, quote, no particular value or range, short of the range between 0 or 1, that the probability in question appears to be, end quote. Here are some more examples from Peter von Inwagen. Von Inwagen uses the letter S in these quotes as a shorthand for the suffering we observe in the world. So he says we are, quote, not in a position to assign any epistemic probability to S on theism, end quote. We are, quote, not in a position to know whether S is what one should expect if theism were true, end quote. And we should, quote, refuse to make any judgments about the relation between the probabilities of S on theism and on the hypothesis of indifference, end quote. The hypothesis of indifference here is an atheistic hypothesis that's inconsistent with theism. Several other skeptical theists say similar things, including Mike Ray, Alvin Plantinga, Daniel Howard Snyder. For those interested in the references and in the sources for those quotes, you can look at my paper, so that goes into the details. However, I should say, and I note this in the paper too, that there are some other skeptical theists. Two examples are Stephen Weikstra and Ted Poston, who respond to Bayesian arguments in a different way. So I don't want to give the impression that all the philosophers out there who call themselves skeptical theists endorse the response I'm criticizing. As I said, my challenge is a narrow one. It's aimed at this particular response. Not all skeptical theists endorse it, although I do think that the majority of skeptical theists either endorse this response or say other things that suggest that they would endorse it if they were engaging with this kind of argument specifically.
Yeah, that's great, Nevin. So what you're looking at then is you're saying like specifically you're targeting this response to this like specific Bayesian argument from evil, where someone's going to say like it's just inscrutable, like from a theistic perspective, like we're really like in the dark, as Bergman says, about like how it's assigning a probability, like to how likely these evils are on like a theistic picture of things. So that's like kind of the big picture you're looking at is like that specific claim, and not all
exactly.
skeptical theism of all the history of philosophy, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So like, how is this idea lead to what you call like theistic skepticism that we're talking about here?
Yeah, so here's the basic idea. Here's what I think. Here's why I think this response leads to a certain kind of skepticism about theism. So suppose we have no idea how probable evil is given theism, because we cannot fathom the kinds of reasons God might have for acting, or the means that might be necessary for God's ends, and so on. Well, then, for all we know, evil does not disconfirm theism at all, which is what the skeptical theist would like. It may even confirm it, if, unbeknownst to us, the evils we observe are actually very likely on theism, more likely than on atheism. But just as for all we know, evil does not disconfirm theism, so for all we know, it does disconfirm it. Indeed, for all we know, it maximally disconfirms it, i.e., entails its falsity. That's because the inscrutability response says that the probability of evil given theism could be anywhere from 0 to 1. But well, suppose it's 0. In this extreme case, evil and theism are just inconsistent, meaning that the probability of theism given evil is also 0. Now, we might try to modify the inscrutability response to say that we can know the probability of evil isn't literally 0. Maybe they were just speaking loosely there. They should say, well, we can know it's not 0, but we can't know anything more about it. I think that this won't solve the problem on its own, though. If the probability of evil given theism could be arbitrarily close to 0, then the probability of theism given evil could also be arbitrarily close to 0. Or it could be quite high, if in fact evil confirms theism. But the important point is that according to the inscrutability response, we have no idea which of these obtains. So we have no idea whether, given evil, it is likely or unlikely that God exists. Given our radical ignorance about the probability of evil given theism, we can't know whether or not it is probable that God exists given evil. So we're simply in the dark about not only the probability of evil given theism, but also the probability of theism given evil. So that's the basic idea. The argument can be made more rigorous by employing Bayes' theorem, which I do in the paper. That lets us see that if the probability of evil given theism could be anywhere from 0 to 1, then the probability of theism given evil could be anywhere from 0 to n, where n is a number the exact value of which depends on the prior probability of theism and the probability of evil given atheism.
Okay, so let me just see if I'm tracking with you. So what we're looking at is we're having this question idea where the skeptical theist in this specific case wants to say that we have no idea how probable evil is given theism, because we just don't know God's reasons. So evil can't disconfirm theism at all. It could even confirm it. We may not know it because it was just in our position according to the skeptical theist. We just don't really know how much evil is really doing. So that makes sense to me. But then I'm wondering, so what specifically is pointing to theistic skepticism, where we just we can't really assign a probability to theism in general based off of this? Where's that happening?
Yeah. So there are two steps, and I've given you one step. So the first step is that if the probability of evil given theism is inscrutable, then the probability of theism given evil is mostly inscrutable. We can't know where it is between 0 and n, where n, like I said, depends on the prior probability of theism and the probability of evil given atheism. And then there's a further question of, well, what about the probability of theism given our total evidence? So one tempting response to this argument is that even if we can't know that theism is probable given evil, we can still know that theism is probable given our total evidence, which includes a lot of things besides evil. But I think the inscrutability response rules that out too. And in a second, and this might help explain how both these steps go, I'll share my screen here. We can look at the math a bit more explicitly. But there are some tricky nuances here in spelling out this second step about how to carve up our evidence and what order to evaluate it in. I go into the weeds in that in the paper for those who are interested. But in brief, let's assume that we have some evidence that we take account of before evil and some evidence that we take into account after evil. And by take into account here, I just mean calculating the impact of this evidence on the probability of theism. So we have what I called our background knowledge when I presented the Bayesian argument at the beginning of this interview. That's the evidence that we take into account before evil, and then we take into account evil, and then there's other evidence that we take into account subsequently to evil. So, for example, maybe we take into account evidence of religious experiences or the miracle reports in the New Testament. We want to know, well, what does that do to the probability of theism after we've accounted for evil? So here it is helpful to get a little bit into the mathematics. So I'm just going to try to share my screen here.
Mm-hmm.
Screen sharing, window.
Yeah, I can see you're sharing your screen. This is helpful for me because we're looking at like what you're trying to say is like, hey, if we're gonna say like the probability of like evil on theism is like inscrutable, we don't know. Then a lot of our other common like assumptions about things like religious experience or these miracle reports, you could throw in like fine tuning or any of these other things. Like we got a question in like, do these provide evidence for theism? Like if you want to be inscrutable about evil, like shouldn't we be like potentially inscrutable about religious experience or miracle reports or other things like that? So I think this is super helpful.
Yeah. So there's this question of how do these other evidences enter in here? Okay, so just sharing the Word document I'm working from here. So here's the odds form of Bayes' theorem. I'll see if I can zoom in on this specifically. So this equation lets us calculate the odds of theism on our evidence. So the odds that a proposition is true is a ratio. It's the ratio of the probability that it's true to the probability that it's false. So if a hypothesis has even odds of being true, as we sometimes say, then its probability is 1/2 and its odds are 1-to-1. Okay, so that's this first term here. Are you able to see when I highlight this here?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's this first term here, this ratio. This is the odds of theism given evil. So the odds form of Bayes' theorem tells us that we can calculate this as a function of these two terms on the right. The first term is the prior odds of theism, that is the probability of theism over the probability of atheism, just taken on their own before we've accounted for evil. By the way, this is all relative to any background knowledge that we've already taken into account. I'm just omitting that from the equations here for simplicity's sake, but it's implicitly there in the background. Okay, so we multiply the prior odds of theism times this second term, which is called the Bayes factor. And this is the probability of our evidence given our hypothesis over the probability of our evidence given the negation of our hypothesis. So the Bayes factor, what it does is it measures how much more likely our evidence is given our hypothesis or given the negation of our hypothesis, relative to any evidences that we've already taken into account. In this case, it's just our background knowledge, which I've omitted from the notation. So in the case at hand, this is the probability of evil given theism over the probability of evil given atheism. Okay, so now according to the inscrutability response, like I said, the probability of evil given theism could be anywhere from 0 to 1. So in the extreme case, suppose it's 0. Well, you can see why that would make the odds of theism 0 as well, because in that case, the Bayes factor here is 0 over whatever the probability of evil given atheism is. And so this second term is 0. You multiply anything else by 0, then the product is 0. So the posterior odds of theism, that is the probability, the odds of theism given evil, is also 0. Okay, so that's if the only evidence we have is evil, then this tells us that the posterior odds of theism given evil are 0. All right, now I'm going to go down to a new equation here. So this second Bayes, or this odds form of Bayes' theorem here that I'm highlighting is the odds of theism given evil and M, where M is some more evidence that we're wanting to take into account. So maybe it's miracle reports in the New Testament, say. So the first two terms on the right-hand side are the same. So those are the terms that let us calculate the odds of theism given evil. Now, what we're trying to get now is the odds of theism given evil and M are more evidence M. And to that, we just multiply through one more term, and that's the Bayes factor for M relative to the evidence we've already taken into account, namely evil. So that last term, that third term on the right-hand side there, the probability of M given theism and evil over the probability of M given atheism and evil, well, you can make that term whatever you like. It doesn't matter how top-heavy it is. That is, it doesn't matter how much more likely M is given theism than given atheism. Because the product of the first two terms is 0, if you multiply it by any other number, the product is still going to be 0. So what that means is that if, for all we know, the odds of theism, and so the probability of theism given evil is 0, then for all we know, adding in further evidence, the probability is still 0, because multiplying 0 by anything else, you still get 0. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and go back to my notes. So
Mm-hmm.
basically what this what these equations show is that it doesn't matter how much more probable any further evidence that you add is given theism than given atheism, because multiplying zero by any other number still yields a product of zero. And so continuing to add more evidence will never let us conclude that the odds of theism are greater than zero. So no matter what our total evidence is, as long as it includes evil, then we're not in a position to rule out the possibility that the probability of theism given our total evidence is zero. So all we can know about the probability of theism given our total evidence is that it's between zero and this upper bound, which I haven't gone into the mathematical details of, but it's going to be probably near one given plausible other assumptions.
So this has been super helpful. So thanks, Nevin. So I'm seeing how, like, if you put a probability of 0 in, it's going to kill your probability for theism. So how does putting a 0 in follow? Because I know that, like, they're saying, like, it's inscrutable. We don't know. So why are you plugging in a 0 for the problem of, like, maybe like the evil on theism or the negation of that? Like, where's the 0? That's the one thing I'm not sure about. Where's the 0 coming from?
Yeah. So what I'm doing is giving like a worst case scenario.
Okay.
So I'm saying, like, what the inscrutability response says is that we can't know anything about the probability of evil given theism. We can just know that it's somewhere between 0 and 1, that's just like mathematically it has to be somewhere between 0 and 1. That's the definition of probability.
Okay.
And so I'm just giving a worst case scenario. Now, I could also give a best case scenario. And then, like I said, we'd end up with this upper bound for the probability of theism. But what the inscrutability response implies is that we can't know where in this range from this worst case scenario to this best case scenario the probability of theism given our evidence is. So for all we know, the probability of theism, it might be high, but it might also be low. It might be as low as 0 or arbitrarily close to 0. And so the inscrutability response implies that we can't know where in this range the probability of theism falls. So consequently, we can't know that theism is probable on our evidence, since for all we know, it could be very low. Yeah. So that's why I'm focusing on this lower bound, not because we're committed to this lower bound, but because it's a worst case scenario that the inscrutability response implies we can't rule out.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful, Nevin. Thinking about, like, say we can't know, so we're gonna take this worst case scenario, and if we play it out, then, like, when we're looking at all this other evidence, like, it's gonna be the same boat for the theist and all that stuff that you think might be pushing theism. If you're gonna, like, be a fan of that inscrutability response, it's gonna really take a hit on those other responses. So yeah, I think that's helpful. So at this point, then, like, does this lead to, like, say if you want to take this inscrutability route and your argument's pretty sound, like, does this lead to us not being able to rationally conclude that, like, God exists?
Yeah, so there is one further step in the argument that it's important to make explicit. So what I've argued so far is that if the probability of evil given theism is inscrutable, then the probability of theism given evidence that includes evil is similarly inscrutable, in that we are in the dark about whether it is probable or improbable on our evidence that God exists. But there's an important distinction to make here. Saying that we can't tell whether it's probable that God exists is different from saying that we can't tell whether God exists. And some theistic philosophers, I think, will want to resist the inference from the former to the latter. I do argue in the paper, though, that if the probability of theism on our evidence is inscrutable in the way that the inscrutability response implies, then we can't rationally believe that God exists. And my argument goes like this. First premise, there's some threshold of probability such that theistic belief is rational only if the probability of theism on our evidence is higher than that threshold. So I don't say what that threshold is. Maybe it's 0.9, maybe it's 0.5, maybe it's 0.01, but it's greater than 0, whatever it is. Theistic belief, in other words, is not compatible with arbitrarily low epistemic probability. So I think that's a pretty modest premise. The second premise, there's a basing requirement on rational belief, where one's belief needs to be properly connected to the facts that make it rational. It's controversial how exactly to spell this out, but I think it's pretty plausible that there is some kind of requirement on rationality here. So to pump your intuitions here, imagine that we have someone who decides what propositions to believe by drawing pieces of paper out of a hat. If the proposition is on the piece of paper she draws out, she believes it, otherwise she doesn't. If this person draws out a piece of paper that says God exists and believes it, her belief isn't rational, even if, in fact, theism is probable on her evidence. And the reason for that is that her belief isn't connected to that probability in the right way. I claim that if the probability of theism, given our evidence, is completely inscrutable in the way the inscrutability response implies, then however we go about forming our belief in theism, we're in no better a situation than this person who draws God exists out of a hat. Our belief can't be properly connected to the fact, if it is a fact, we don't know whether it's a fact, but if it is a fact, that the probability of theism given our evidence is greater than the threshold for rational belief. And so our belief is not rational because it's not based on the probability of theism being high in the right way.
That's actually really interesting. So, if I'm following you right, Nevin, like say someone like wants to hold like an inscrutability response and like answering the problem of evil, and they're like, okay, like I have that, but like I have this like super intense like religious experience that points me towards Christianity because I saw like God heal an amputee, something like that. And what you're saying is like, hey, if you're gonna say the probability of like evil is like inscrutable on theism, we just don't know. You need to say like, hey, the probability of like God healing an amputee right in front of you, like that's inscrutable on theism. Like we gotta be consistent here. If that's the case, like you have no way of knowing like how likely that is on theism in the same way you do with like the data of evil. If that's the case, then like that experience actually doesn't support theism if we're being consistent.
Yeah. So just to be careful, so what I would say is that if you accept the inscrutability response, then you should say that the probability of theism, given that experience you had of God healing this amputee, that the probability of theism, given that experience and evil, is inscrutable as well. And so even if you can tell that that evidence is much more likely on theism than atheism, what you can't conclude is that theism is probable given that evidence, because theism ends up being inscrutable because you've got this evil in there in your evidence as well, which has inscrutable probability on this reply to the problem of evil. So that kind of example, I think, because I think it is plausible that, look, if you witness an obvious miracle, maybe you shouldn't be certain that God exists. Maybe there are other possible explanations, but I think it's rational to be confident that God exists if you witness an obvious miracle. And it's rational to think that the probability of theism, given your experience, is pretty high. But I think that just shows that the inscrutability response is not very plausible because it has the consequence that you can't tell in that scenario that the probability of theism is high. But it's plausible that you can tell that the probability of theism is high. Like, forget about what we're rational in believing, assuming that you haven't personally witnessed a miracle. Just think about somebody who does witness something that is extremely hard to explain naturalistically. Well, it's plausible that that person is rational in thinking that the probability of theism, given their evidence, is quite high. But the inscrutability response says that no, they're not rational in thinking that. They're in the dark about whether theism is probable given their evidence. So I think that suggests that's kind of a more direct way of seeing that the inscrutability response has an implausible consequence.
Okay. Yeah, that's super helpful, Nevin. I appreciate that a lot. And this is hopefully very helpful to people listening. So we got this conundrum here. Like surely we don't want to say like you can't trust like your religious experiences like evidence against or evidence for the existence of God. So in light of everything we've been talking about, Nevin, like what should theists do?
Yeah, so that's a big question. But let me focus on the Bayesian argument I gave earlier and how skeptical theists might respond to it. So I think one issue here is that many skeptical theists seem to commit themselves to denying the modest claim that evil is some evidence against theism. But I think theists put themselves in a bad position when they stake their theism on denying this claim, because this claim is really very weak. It just says that this one piece of evidence, the evils that we observe, is better predicted by atheism than by theism to some degree. You can agree with this, but still deny that our total evidence makes theism improbable. There are multiple ways to do this. Excuse me. So, one thing you might say is that while evil is somewhat more surprising on theism than atheism, there are still somewhat plausible explanations that theists can give for evil. So theodicy, the attempt to give explanations for why God allows for evil, it's not an all or nothing game. We don't have to be 100% confident in a particular explanation for evil, say the hypothesis that the evils we observe are necessary for the development of virtue. Even if we think this hypothesis is just moderately plausible, that might be enough to make it so that evil is not extremely improbable given theism, and so that consequently evil may not disconfirm theism to an insurmountable degree. The second, and this is complementary to the first response, these responses are not mutually exclusive. You might argue that we have other positive evidences for theism that outweigh the evidence against theism given to us by evil. So even if evil makes theism less probable, when we take evil together with the fine-tuning of physics for intelligent life, miracle reports, religious experiences, and so on, we may find that theism is more probable than not, all things considered. It's very rare that all the evidences we have on a question support one hypothesis over another. Usually we have conflicting evidences that point in different directions, and we have to make a judgment about how they balance off against each other. To be rational, the theist just has to be able to reasonably judge that the evidences for theism outweigh the evidences against theism, not that there are no evidences against theism. So that's general background about how theists might respond to a Bayesian argument from evil. Is there anything special that skeptical theism can bring to the table here? Well, I think maybe. In particular, it might contribute to the first strategy, arguing that the probability of evil given theism is not as low as we might initially have thought. Instead of arguing that our cognitive limitations mean that we have no idea how probable it is that God would act one way rather than another, as the inscrutability response would suggest, skeptical theists could instead argue that our cognitive limitations should just keep us from being super confident in any particular hypothesis about how God would act. So here I think an analogy might help. I listened to your interview with Justin McBrayer about skeptical theism, and he mentions this analogy of imagining that you're watching a grandmaster play a chess match. I think to make the analogy precise, at least for my purposes here, we should say that you have two hypotheses you're deciding between. So hypothesis one says that this chess player you're watching is a grandmaster, and hypothesis two says that he's just making moves randomly. Mm-hmm. So suppose that this player has 100 moves available to him. So that conditional on the randomness hypothesis, each move has a probability of 1 in 100. Now he makes a move that doesn't look very good to you. Your first reaction is there's only a 1 in 10,000 chance he would play that move if he's a grandmaster. So the move is 100 times more likely on the randomness hypothesis than the grandmaster hypothesis. Now, a strong skeptical theist might look at this and say, well, when you reflect on the epistemic gap between you and a chess grandmaster, how much there is you don't know about chess strategy and so on, you should conclude that the player's making this move is no evidence that he's not a grandmaster. Well, again, here, as in the case of theism, I think this is just too strong. Even if your knowledge of chess is limited, you shouldn't think that all moves are equally likely, conditional on the grandmaster hypothesis. It's reasonable to think that some moves are more likely than others. You can make some predictions here. But I do think a weaker claim here might be plausible, and that's that reflection on your epistemic limitations should lead you to be a little more humble and moderate your judgments about what a grandmaster is going to do. And you can do this not by saying that you have no idea what the probability is, but just by moving your probability estimates for different moves closer to all being equal, so closer to 1 in 100. And so maybe after you do this, you think now that the chance that a grandmaster would make this move is 1 in 1,000 rather than 1 in 10,000. And so on your new probability estimates, the move is only 10 times more likely given the randomness hypothesis than given the grandmaster hypothesis. In a similar way, reflection on the epistemic gap between us and God might lead us to moderate our probabilities that God would act in particular ways. Once we do this, we might move from saying that evil is 100 times less likely given theism than atheism to saying that it's only 10 times less likely, or whatever. So in this way, reflection on our epistemic limitations could blunt the evidential force of the atheistic argument from evil, but not by making us say that evil is no evidence against theism, but by making us say that it is weaker evidence than we might initially have thought. Now, there are a lot of open questions here in this line of reasoning that I've sketched. Like, there are questions about what implications does this strategy have for the force of positive arguments for theism. But I think exploring this line of reasoning would be a more fruitful way for skeptical theists to apply their skepticism to Bayesian arguments from evil.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Nevin. And I like how you kind of like broke this up into a couple things. And like you're like, what should theists do from here? And one is like, hey, maybe you want to just not be a skeptical theist at all, and like maybe like bite a bullet on the problem of evil and say, but hey, maybe we have this data like fine tuning or experience of the New Testament that's really going to push this theism stuff way higher. So I like that. And I also really like saying like, hey, we should have a softer version of skeptical theism, because at least like for me personally, I don't want to put on a full like Bayesian cap and say like, hey, there's a 91.28% chance this would be expected on like maybe like atheism, but not theism, because I think that's overreaching with our limitations. But I do think that like obviously the super strong version, like you're talking about, like it's gonna have a lot of issues. But if we could have like a softer skeptical theism and be like, hey, just realize that like we should be less confident in conclusions. They realize that like, hey, there's a good chance we got a little bit off here in our reasoning. Yeah, I think that's super great, and I really like that. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say like, and I kind of had this impression during the interview. I was like, I feel like I agree with Nevin a lot. So yeah.
Yeah. So like you said, I didn't get into this, but you could also. So giving up the inscrutability response doesn't mean that you have to think we can know the precise probabilities in play
Mm-hmm.
here. You might think that, well, the most we can know about them is that they're like in some range. Maybe we
Mm-hmm.
can know like rough comparative values of some of these probabilities, and that's often enough for Bayesian reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
We don't always need to know absolute values if we can just tell that, oh, this probability or this evidence rather is roughly twice as likely, or it's between 2 and 10 times as likely given this hypothesis and given its negation. That's enough to let us draw substantive conclusions about the probability of the hypothesis given our evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to commit yourselves to making precise probability judgments if you give up this strong inscrutability claim that says that we can say nothing about the probability. Another thing that you might say is like, well, we can still make estimates of probabilities. We can say, look, my best guess is that this probability is this, and this other probability is this, and then when we run the calculation, here's what we get. But that's tentative. I'm open to revising. You can
Mm-hmm.
spell out the hypotheses more. You can, give some theodicies that make me rethink how likely it is that God would allow evils and so on. And then I might revise my probability estimates. And
Yeah.
that's usually the way that I would prefer to go rather than working with ranges, which is messy in its own way.
Mm-hmm.
So all that to say that giving up on the inscrutability response doesn't, I think, commit us to a certain kind of like really naive precision that says, yeah, we can know the probability of theism given our total evidence is 98.72% or whatever. No, well, of course we can't know that, but we might
Mm-hmm.
be able to know some more modest things like that. It's more probable given our evidence than not, or that these evidences support it, these other evidences disconfirm it, and here's how it looks like these things balance off. So I think that we can say some of these more modest things, even if we don't go all the way to committing ourselves to precise probabilities that we're sure of.
Yeah. Well, I think that's spot on, Evan. Yeah. Yeah, it's great. So maybe like, what are your thoughts then on like skeptical theism? Like, would you be like obviously you're not gonna take a super strong form. Would you be more friendly towards a weaker form, or you just like want to get rid of that whole project in and of itself?
Yeah, I'm open to something more modest, like the line of reasoning that I sketched at the end here.
Hmm.
That, well, maybe we should be modest in our judgments about the probability that God would act in particular ways. I think we shouldn't be super confident that God would create a universe that was one way rather than another, or that God has these ends rather than these other ends. There are certainly multiple hypotheses about what God would want and what means would be necessary for God's ends that we should take seriously. um, and so that kind of modest skeptical theism, I think I'm sympathetic to. But yeah, I wouldn't see that as mutually exclusive to theodicies, because like I said earlier, theodicy isn't an all or nothing game. I think there are some theodicies that are more plausible than others. There are none that I would say I'm certain are right. So I would, I guess, adopt a mixed strategy of saying, yeah, we should take our cognitive limitations into account, and that should lead us to a certain kind of modesty, but not to an extreme skepticism. And then we should look at possible theodicies. Some might be more plausible than others, and we should also look at the other evidences for theism. And then I think when we combine those, then my own judgment is that theism ends up looking pretty good on the total evidence. But yeah, so I wouldn't. stake. I wouldn't put all my eggs into one response. I think that you can have all of those things together.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's super great, Nevin. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we did a great job like covering everything here. Any like last thoughts or things you want to say with regards to this before we start to wrap up here?
No, I think I'm pretty happy with what we've covered.
Yeah, I feel the same way, and I feel like this was super smooth. So yeah, I really enjoyed this a lot. And so Nevin, like, how can people like follow you, connect with you, things like that?
Yeah, so if you just Google my name, then my website will come up. I try to keep it updated with all of my papers. I've also done a little bit of public philosophy, so some short, more accessible things. Like I have a piece for Aeon magazine on the interpretation of probability. That's also on my website, and it'll probably come up if you search as well. And yeah, and I did a YouTube interview with Cameron Bertuzzi. That's on my website as well. So yeah, if you just go to my website, then you can see both those more public facing things, and then also my academic work is all there for people to read as well if they're interested.
Well, that's super cool, Nevin. Thank you everyone for listening today. Encourage people to check out Nevin and his work. There's a link down below where you can follow him and connect with him and things like that. And if you're new here, always encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, and all that fun stuff. Really appreciate your support of Adherent Apologetics. And yeah, that's it. If you value our content, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/adherentapologetics. You can become a patron for as little as $1 a month. And that is huge. Appreciate the support a lot. No new patrons just think that's the last time we recorded. But yeah, that's that. Nevin, thank you so much for joining. So grateful for your time and hope you have a good day as I head into evening and it's got darker and darker behind me as we've recorded this. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for having me, and have a good night.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Have a good one and God bless. We'll catch you.